Thank you. All right, good morning. I'm Mike Burney, and I'm joined by my colleague Dave Shepard. We're both from the newly created Data Acquisitions and Curation area within the Economics Directorate at the Census Bureau. And this morning we're going to talk about the quality of administrative records as source data. And a few of the topics that we want to touch on this morning are a little bit about the data acquisition and curation area, not just because I like saying it, but also because one of the major impetuses behind the creation of this was quality. How do we better assess the quality of the administrative records data that we bring in the door at the Census Bureau so that we can better assure the quality of any applications that those data are used for within the Census Bureau? I'll start with a definition of what are administrative record source data, so that we're sort of on common ground with what we're talking about during the rest of the presentation. Why we have an increase in quality measures at the Census Bureau, that's another thing that I just want to point out. Again, because this reorganization sort of is proof of that increased emphasis on quality. I'll define the general quality framework that we're operating under, that we're proceeding under. I want to be clear up front, a lot of what Dave and I are both going to talk about are things about where we want to be, where we recognize we need to be, not necessarily where we are right now. And then Dave will talk a little bit about the data quality branch, some of the experiences to have, the little data quality review overview, and then the priorities of where we want to be in the future. First of all, a little bit about the data acquisition and curation area. It's brand new. It's only a few weeks old, and it was essentially a transfer of the functions within the Research and Methodology Directorate's Center for Administrative Records Research and Applications into the Economic Directorate's Economic Reimbursable Surveys Division. And those functions include the acquisition of administrative records data, the processing, and the making available of those data to other customers within the Census Bureau. Essentially, we acquire, we process, and we put data elsewhere for people to use for various applications. This reorganization also added a data ingest capability to our operation. Prior to this, our function in ADRM had the data coming into one part of the ADRM and then moved to us for the rest of the work. In the interest of efficiencies and emphasis on quality, we're making that all in one step now. It's ingest directly to our area from outside. And this reorganization also established a data quality branch that Dave leads. Dave inherited both the ingest responsibilities and the data quality responsibilities of this reorganization. A little more about our area, just to give you a scope of our activities. We, at any given time, manage a portfolio of about 150 different interagency agreements that deal with administrative records data. Those agreements could be for the straight acquisition of those data into the Census Bureau, or it could be supporting joint statistical research projects with other federal agencies involving the use of those data. Again, just to give you an idea of a level of activity, during last fiscal year, we brought in more than 16,000 individual administrative records and survey data files into our systems, and we used those to create over 1,100 research data sets to put in the data warehouse. Again, just to give you an idea, that number in 17 was a little bit over 1,100 research data sets that we created. In fiscal year 14, that number was 300. So we went from 300 to 1,100 between 2014 and 2017. What are administrative records data sources? Those are the data that originate from federal, state, or third-party sources, and we consider them standalone as they come in. And a little bit of background about the as they come in. Because we at the Census Bureau have the authority to go out and ask for these data, that doesn't necessarily mean that the other source agencies are required to give it to us. So we often will take data however we can get it, just to bring it in the door and to do the best we can. We found that if we start pushing the source data too far for defined formats and content, that relationship sometimes breaks off. We might lose that data acquisition altogether. So that gives you a little bit of background of some of the quality issues that we might see when we bring those data in, because we'll take them as we can get them. So why the reorganization and why the increased emphasis on quality? more sources. We're getting more sources of administrative records data in. I just gave you some numbers about the increase from 14 to 17. Because we're getting so many data sources in, and this is something that's just been recently raised, there's a distinction that needs to be made between signals and noise. What is valuable for what? We're getting so many data sets in with income data, for example. Which are the most valuable? Which are good data? Which are not as good data? So in addition to more data, we're getting more potential users of data, and that includes users for decennial operations, for the 2020 census operations, for various surveys that the Census Bureau conducts, and that's largely driven by the cost of running these traditional surveys and the declining response rates, and how administrative records might be able to help that. And then research. There's more and more research that's being done using administrative records. And with all these users, there's questions about the source of the data, and we're finding that many of those questions we can't answer, and thus sort of this increased emphasis by creating a data quality branch and the reorganization in and of itself. And to set the framework for the quality work that we want to do, we divided it really into the qualitative and the quantitative factors. And for the qualitative, we're drawing largely on the citation below there, which was an FCSM project paper created a few years ago. The first qualitative factor is relevance. Does it meet the user requirements? Generally, a big part of fitness for use. And one aspect that's come up with meeting user requirements just recently that we're working through is replicability. If we create a statistic using administrative records data tomorrow, will we be able to create that same statistics 5 years from now? Given the nature of the licensing of some of these data that come in, the retention policy of those data that come in, so those are the sorts of things that we look at in relevance. Accessibility, can we acquire the data? In our market research, we often find data that we think would meet the Census Bureau requirements, but it may be unattainable. There may be legislative change that's required to acquire those data. It may be cost prohibitive. It may be, if it's a great data set, but it costs $5 million, well, it's not really accessible to us unless we can find the $5 million. Coherence, consistent over time and geography. We're in communication with all 50 states about acquiring various state-level data. And how do we know that one state, that Minnesota, keys data into a program file the same way that Michigan keys data into that same program file, be that TANF, SNAP, or WIC? And so those are the sorts of things that we look at in terms of coherence. Interpretability, can we understand it when we get it in? Are there metadata associated with it that we can understand what we're getting? Accuracy, close to known values. The institutional environment, quality of the source, that's another big thing. If we have some sort of indicator of the quality of source, it helps us determine the quality of those data as we put it into our systems. And then the second is quantitative factors. Are there metrics? What's the degree of missingness of data elements that come in? What's the degree of out of bounds of values within those data elements? Metrics that we can produce that will give us some indicator of quality. And then finally, cost effectiveness. Again, if we have a data set that costs $5 million, and we do have $5 million, is there $5 million worth of value of bringing that in? Does it offset or does it enhance our operations to that degree? So I'm going to turn it over to Dave now. He can talk a little bit more about some of the data quality observations that he's had and some of the priorities that he wants to focus on.
All right, thanks, Mike. Like you said, my staff's recently been charged with taking over the ingest and clearance for much of the administrative records data that comes into the Census Bureau. By ingest, when I use that word today, I'm talking about the files we receive, the files and the metadata from our source providers. By clearance, I mean that we conduct a review when those files first come in to determine if they meet our criteria for acceptance, for being passed on to users, and then be put somewhere to be made available for provisioning later. So far, the talks, I'm hearing a lot of aspirational, what we want to do, what we should do, what we should figure out. I'm going to talk a little more today about maybe something much more mundane, what we are doing right now, and then where we see the potential next steps for us in order to improve what we're doing. First thing, obviously, is we want to develop our processes and procedures to more standardize these ingest and clearance processes that have been going on at the Bureau for a long time. We're not, the Census Bureau isn't new to bringing data in. It's just my staff that is. When we develop these processes, as we've been starting to look into them, we think one of the opportunities for improvement is this relationship with the provider. And as Mike pointed out, and we certainly understand that we don't want to spook anyone and discourage them from providing data to us, but our initial work so far has led us to believe that some of the providers, we could make their job more easy. We can make their job better and more easy to, I got some words in there somewhere. We can streamline this process if we have more conversations with them, have our technical people talk to their technical people, and be specific about what would work best for us. And maybe that would work best for them. Or maybe we can come to some agreement about how we can do this best. The approach of just throwing over the fence whatever file they put together doesn't serve either side. Some of the providers have already told us that they wish we had told them what exactly we wanted, and then they could have produced that. As far as our internal workings, we had different areas doing parts of this ingest and clearance process, so we had a lot of handoffs. We had a lot of what might be duplication of efforts, so we'd like to try to address some of those. Once we formalize the process, we want to be constantly looking to improve that process. And I think a lot of the talk so far today, the factors Mike was just pointing out from that paper, are the kinds of things we're going to be looking toward. And the last thing is that we create a lot of metadata as we're reviewing the files. Some of that has been made available to select users or select parts of the Bureau, but we feel like that needs to be made more available, and that probably more of what we're discovering during the ingest process could be shared further on. First, I want to mention some of the prior experiences my staff has had in our role more of working with surveys and how quality has been a focus of what we've been doing. We built a contact frame about 5 years ago working with the decennial census, linking residential addresses to phone numbers and email addresses. It was built primarily with commercial data, and it has really great coverage as we've been collecting data over the last 5 years. We've been able to use a truth deck, respondent-provided phones, respondent-provided emails from our surveys and censuses in order to evaluate that frame, as well as to help us build models to predict the better phone numbers when there's multiple phone numbers associated with an address. For our request for proposals, when we're not getting data from an agency, when we have choices among different vendors, and we have a request for proposal out, we've been insisting that they provide sample data. Again, we're in a really good position that we have a lot of data. We have a master address file of all the addresses in the country. We have a census done in 2010 of all the people in the country, so we have some data to compare to for that sample data that's passed to us. So we can evaluate the coverage and the quality of that data they want to sell us, and purchase the data that's really going to be the best value for the government for the purposes we have in mind for that data. Another project we worked on bought teacher lists. The National Teacher Principal Survey sampling frame is based on the list schools provide us. So we've been doing this over a number of years, culminating in this year where the provider, the data we're buying is the first line of the roster for those schools, and we're giving the schools an opportunity to improve that list. So we're presenting them with a list we already have of their teachers. The way we got this far was by not just comparing vendors and comparing data that schools provide to what these vendors can give us, but then by doing an adjudication study where we went back to schools and looked to see what happens when the vendor data varies from what the schools provided. And I'm not sure we knew what really to expect. Obviously, when the school said something, it was almost always right. But a large percentage of the time, close to 50% of the time, when the vendor provided us the name of a teacher, the school didn't, the school later acknowledged that was a teacher at their school. So we were able to get a better handle on the value that these vendor data could add to that project. The last project I want to talk about is our involvement with comparing administrative records to some survey response data. We're looking toward the blending of data in some of our surveys for either replacement or supplements to the data that we collect. In each of these cases, we had the luxury of some data we considered truth, and we're able to focus the degree of agreement with the administrative records data from both a coverage and an accuracy perspective. But certainly through all of these projects, many of the data quality framework factors have been discussed throughout. One thing that maybe isn't intuitive, but I'll just say it anyway, is the first time we get data from someone, it's less likely to be exactly what we're looking for. It's less likely we're going to be able to interpret it correctly right out of the box. But we often do have ongoing relationships with providers. So once we do these first-time reviews and we uncover a lot more issues, and then we can spend some time working out those issues with the provider. We do this by reviewing the test data, leading to discussions about our concerns with the provider, and requests for clarifications about what we see in the data. Typically, we've seen that subsequent deliveries are more on mark with what we're looking for, and so we have a more streamlined review process and fewer concerns. 4 questions. I think we're trying to get our head around what are the things we really think we're doing when we bring this data in and when we clear it or say it's okay to get provisioned. And the 4 questions we're asking right now is, can we process the delivery? Are all parts of the delivery consistent? Are the data reasonable? And do we meet the customer's requirements? The agreement helps us to understand what they agreed to provide and what usages were agreed to. Hopefully we get this information prior to any files being delivered so that we can mull that over in advance. Obviously, if files are encrypted, we need a password. We have to make sure we have it. But I think where more of this comes in is when we look at the metadata that was provided to go along with the microdata. We request both record layouts as well as data dictionaries. Without them, we're not able to appropriately review the data, and the end users need to make assumptions about what the data represent. So this is required that we get as much of this as we can, and we'll contact the provider if it's missing or incomplete. Finally, is the file in a format we're capable of reviewing and converting to the SAS files that right now are the standard for provisioning at the Census Bureau. Even file formats that seem acceptable can have some problems. If there's delimiters that are contained within the data elements, for example, the data will be difficult for us to convert. Agreement details tell us what we should expect, and we'll look to see if we got what we were expecting in the first aspect of this consistency question. We get record counts and record lengths to help ensure there weren't errors in the transmission and help us catch when the providers grab the wrong file when completing their delivery. We match the file contents to the layout and to the values and the valid values listed in the data dictionary. For example, the data dictionary for one file showed us that the race variables had codes from 1 to 5, but when we looked at the data, we saw 9 different values. That data wouldn't be able to be interpreted correctly. We'll go back to the provider to get a better understanding of what those categories were. These kind of issues are usually resolved in consultation with the providers. Is the data reasonable? Now, there's certainly way more we could do here, but for right now, we're looking at things like the reasonableness of the values. We're looking for empty fields, partially filled fields, fields with that appear to have non-meaningful data based on the labels or the data dictionary definitions. Some fields have appeared truncated in the past, like the time we had record layouts that had the wrong field length, so we read the data in and it didn't align with the layout, or contain hidden characters, which sometimes makes us think there's data present for a variable when it really isn't. We confirm with the provider that whatever is in there is really what they had and what they had intended to provide to us. We review certain variables more closely to ensure they adhere to the format specified. These include dates, social security numbers, phone numbers, email address, date abbreviations, things that that there is some structure or format to that variable, and we expect this list to grow over time. And then the last thing, did we meet the customer's requirements? For us, our customer is the group at the Census Bureau that provisions the data to users who are approved for using the data. They put it in what we call the data warehouse, and it's recorded in the data management system. But these requirements right now, at least as far as we can tell, include the creation of SAS data sets, which is how we store the data, where sensitive variables are dropped or separated. Some users are only allowed access to certain parts of the file, and our linking variables are added to these SAS data sets. We make the metadata available to end users and follow file naming conventions of the data warehouse. And where possible and where resources permit, we may compare counts or generated statistics to benchmarks that are shared with us, are publicly available, or align with previous deliveries. This can require closer coordination with the end users of the data, and it's something we'd like to do more of as our quality review process matures. Like I said, we are where we are. We're taking over a process that has been going on at the Census Bureau for years and years. So first, we just want to make sure we're documenting and baselining an established process that we can follow and people can know what exactly we're doing when we say the files are ready for provisioning. But we certainly see, and as the talks earlier today have shown, there's a lot more we should be doing moving forward. Once we've established our process, we want to look specifically more closely with providers to better coordinate their delivery and make sure we get what they need to send us. We'll improve by working closely with internal data customers, data users, so we can look more closely at the data elements that are most important to their work, and by sharing some metadata, more of the metadata, more widely, to share what we've learned about the file to help the researchers understand the files better and faster. Once we baseline what we're doing, we'll be looking towards sharing what we develop while continuing to adapt best practices to continuously improve our process. And we'll be following the work of many of you as time goes on.